If you're building a SaaS, you're gonna hear the word multi-tenancy. So what does that actually mean? It's actually pretty hard to figure out what people mean exactly with that. Now, a tenant can literally be a single user, or it can be a company or a team or some department, basically some entity that's using our SaaS. If there is multi-tenancy, there's also single tenancy. And actually it's a bit theoretical here. I will quickly go through it, but with single tenancy, you can imagine some kind of enterprise on-prem software. So if you have a software and you get a customer, right, a tenant, let's say an enterprise company, you would literally go to their servers, their hardware servers, and you would install your app and your data store on their hardware. And then when you get another customer, right, another tenant, you would do the same. You would go to their hardware and you would install it on their premises or literally their hardware. And the benefit is that the data is completely isolated, right? So, and as well as the compute, right? So your actual app that's running, these are completely isolated from each other. So it's as secure as it's reasonably gonna get. And also with some of these larger enterprises, they often want to customize it, right? So they have full control over how much compute they want to assign to the app, right? And things like that. Now in the real world, I don't think this is very common anymore. I think it used to be more common when the cloud hadn't really taken off yet. But these days, my guess is that the vast majority of software is multi-tenant. So maybe we're selling, for example, a B2B expense management SaaS. Right now, this is all in the cloud. So what we have is if we get a customer, right, so a tenant, and we get another one, and we get another one, we're not going to create separate instances of our SaaS, right? We're just gonna have, one instance running on some server, and all of the customers will connect to that. And probably the same with the data, right? So we are probably going to have one database and all of those customers' data will be in that one database, right? So here in the multi-tenancy setup, it's shared. The hardware is shared. And the benefits here are, of course, it's much cheaper and scalable and easier to maintain than in this setup here, where this is very high friction, right? If you want to update something, you have to update all the instances. Whereas here, you just have to update that one instance, right? So this, from a developer point of view, is much more efficient. So I would say these days, in the world of SaaS, I would say the vast majority is going to be a setup like this. Now, sometimes when people say multi-tenancy, they also mean when you have, for example, a platform where your users can create, let's say, a blog. So then you would give them a subdomain. So the first customer would get blog1.domain.com, and then another customer, another tenant would get blog2.domain.com. Imagine you're building some kind of e-commerce software which allows your users to create an e-commerce website, right? So you would give them a subdomain. So each customer would get their own subdomain, let's say. Right? That doesn't have much to do with the underlying hardware. I'll show you an example of that in a second. We can do that with just some clever, and actually just to give you an example of that in the world of Next.js, Vercel has an interesting template on this, the platforms template. So the way that they do it is they essentially, when there's an incoming request, you need to know who is making that request and which tenant essentially, right? So if there's an incoming request to blog 2 here in the Next.js app, what they do is in the middleware, they catch it. So here at the bottom here, they sort of rewrite this. Well, not sort of, they actually rewrite this to a new URL. So if there's an incoming request to blog 2, they rewrite that so it becomes just part of the path. So we sort of rewrite it from subdomain to a standard path. That is essentially what they're doing in this part here. You can find that on the Vercel's GitHub account. So then the actual subdomain actually becomes part of the path. So then here with the app router, you can have a dynamic route, and that's going to be the domain. So then you can use params to actually get the domain that the request is for. Right, so that's a bit of a clever trick that you can use in the world of Next.js for a multi-tenant platform type of setup. It doesn't really have that much to do with the underlying hardware. It's just a clever way of rewriting. But that's what some people will mean when they talk about multi-tenancy. But for SaaS and how to set up the hardware, essentially, the vast majority today, especially in the cloud, is going to have some kind of setup like this, where all your customers, your tenants, so the app that we have is going to run on some server or servers, but it's like the same instance. And so that compute is shared amongst them. And for the data is not completely isolated necessarily. right? So in a setup like this, yes, there are many benefits to us as a developer, but you do have to come up with a very robust way of making sure that this tenant does not accidentally get to see the data from this tenant, right? Remember, when we're building an app, the most valuable thing that we have ultimately is actually our data, right? If we make some mistake with the UI, right, we render the wrong button or something like that, it's not the end of the world. As long as it doesn't really expose any data, or it doesn't allow some tenant to update data that they shouldn't have access to, right? So data and the access to that data is paramount. And so with a setup like this, it becomes really important that we have our authentication set up properly and that we route any incoming request, right? So there's an incoming request to our app. We need to make sure which tenant is making that request so we can retrieve the data from the database that belongs only to that tenant, right? We do not want to get our customers emailing us about why they can see other people's data, right? That's the last thing you want. So in a setup like this, how can we still make sure that the data is properly isolated? Well, if we have one database and we have one, schema essentially for everyone, we're gonna have, let's say, a table or collection if you're using NoSQL, but you're gonna have some data and you're gonna have a bunch of entries, right? Your rows in a SQL database, and you could simply have a column for a tenant ID. So if we are getting an incoming request to our app from tenant ID number 5, then we know that when we interact with our database, we need to have a filter so that we only retrieve the rows where tenant ID is 5, right? So let's say I'm actually trying to list out all the expenses for a particular tenant, right? So here in the Next.js app router, I can use a server component with async await. And here I'm using an ORM, Prisma. So here I can use prisma.expense, right? Let's say we're building a B2B expense management app. So we want to list all the expenses. I can use expense.findMany. But if I leave off this filter, essentially, if I just do this, it will get all of the expenses from my database. So it would then get all of these, right, all of the data here. But remember, this tenant should not get access to the data of the other tenants. With a setup like this, it becomes very important that your database queries have this where filter, only the data that belongs to that particular tenant. How do you know the tenant's ID? Well, that will come from your authentication solution. So let's say I'm using Kind. I'm a brand ambassador for Kind. It's a paid sponsorship, but I think it's a great solution for authentication. They are also today's sponsor. Let's say that in a B2B app like that, the tenant is going to be a company, right, or an organization, right? So here the tenant ID would actually simply be the organizational ID, or what Kind calls org code. This all comes out of the box with Kind. I'll show you that in a second, right? So whatever authentication solution you may be using, that's typically where you're going to get your ID from, so that you can then properly filter the data. So that's one approach you can take, and I would say this is probably the easiest approach. So if you're a startup, for example, this would probably be the easiest way to get started, but it's not the only option you have actually. So if you still want to keep one database, but you want a little bit more isolation between each tenant's data, you can also set up a schema per tenant, right? So Postgres, and it depends a bit on your database solution, but typically there's going to be some solution to have a more robust isolation between data. So if you're a little bit more familiar with databases, or if you're building an app where there are more stringent data isolation requirements, maybe you're building a healthcare or banking or some really regulated type of application, and so you don't want to take any risks, this may be the solution you want to go for, right? So then you would have a setup like this where you still have one database, but at the database level there are solutions for isolating that further. But I would say it comes with more setup and more necessary skill at the database level. Now, it is actually also possible that you really want to keep separate databases for each tenant. You can still have separate database for each tenant, but it comes with additional complexities, and that it may be worthwhile if your specific app really needs that. That may be really highly regulated enterprise type of application where the data needs to be as isolated as possible. But let's say for the purpose of this video, we do want to keep one database and we're just going to have one schema essentially for all the data. So let me quickly walk you through an example of how that would work in, let's say, a B2B expense management SaaS. So let's say we have a B2B expense management SaaS. So right now we just have 3 expenses in our database. So here we have an expense for the group dinner, right? Some expense, it was $150. We have another expense here for a new desk. it was $200, and we have some coffee beans for $50. Now different tenants have created these. In our setup here, we need to keep track of which tenant created each expense here, or at least has access to that expense. And right now you can see I didn't add that yet, right? So I created a column for that in my schema. So I'm using Prisma here in my schema.prisma. I just created this model like this, right? So here we have a tenant ID, but to do that we will need some authentication, right? So here now what I'm doing is I'm getting all of those expenses from my database. I'm saying Prisma expense find many. I don't have any filter here, right? So it's just going to get all of them from the table, and we get those expenses, and that's what we're mapping over here, right? So now I'm getting all of the expenses from my database, but of course when somebody goes to this page, they shouldn't see all of the data. They should only see the data that belongs to them, right? So the data needs to be isolated based on the tenant ID. So to do that, it's very important that we have the authentication right? So there's some incoming request, right? Somebody's coming to our app, we're just loading the page, there's an incoming request from, let's say, this tenant. And so here in our app, we need to figure out who is that, their identity, probably also roles and permissions. We'll talk about that in a second as well. And then we will make some query to our database and have the appropriate filter. So right now we don't have any authentication solution. So let's add that. So I'm going to use Kind. Kind actually has a very generous free tier as of recording. You can find a link in the description, by the way, if you want to sign up right now. It's very easy. I'll show you very quickly how to do that. So here I can just quickly add an application. I will say B2B expense tool, okay, and I'll pick backend web. Next.js is actually more of a backend framework. It's a full stack framework, but it's very backend heavy. So they have a nice template here for Next.js. I will click on save. I have an existing code base, and let me actually zoom in a little bit. So here I can just say set, and then another set, boom, boom. Okay, I need to install the Kind package. So I will quickly just copy paste that and install that right here. Okay, install that package. Then I'm gonna add the environment variables. I will quickly create .env.local and just paste that right here. Now after logging in, let's just redirect them to the home page. We just have one page in this very simple app. And then the last thing I need to do is add the API endpoint, which Kind will use internally to wire everything up in our Next.js app. Now what I can do is I can just copy the entire path and just paste that right here, and it should, yeah, that should work like that. Okay, then we just need to copy and paste this, right? So very easy to set up. It's just a bunch of copy paste. Okay, and then we can also decide how users should be able to log in. So here we have some options. We have social connections here. I'm just going to use the GitHub here, but you can see there are many options here. They also have the enterprise connections here. Okay, so I'm going to save there. Now we have installed Kind, so now we can use their built-in components if we want. So let's actually add that here to the header, right? So I created a header component which I included as part of the layout, right? So the header is what we see on top here. So then here I can go to header, and here I can add a login link and a logout link. I'm keeping it very basic here. Okay, but how is this going to help us? Well, we need some kind of tenant ID. So what we're going to do is each user that signs up is going to be part of some organization, right? And each organization has a certain ID. That's what we're going to use as these tenant IDs, right? So each organization is a tenant in this app. I think that's pretty common for like a B2B type of application. So it's very easy to do with Kind, right? So Kind here under organizations, we can create organizations here in the dashboard, also in code. So we can create organizations here if I want, but by default there is already a default organization, and all your users automatically belong to this default organization, right? And we can create new organizations and have new users be part of that as they sign up, but by default we just have one, and here they have their code, right? So this is actually what we would like to use in this example as our tenant ID. And let's actually create an organization here, and I'll just save it. So now I have two organizations in my app. They both have 0 users right now. So let me actually sign in here, and by default when I sign up here, this is the first time I'm clicking sign in here, so it will create an account for me, and by default it will be part of that default organization. All right, so I'm redirected here. If I go to inspect application cookies, right, so now here you can see I have my tokens, my access token, so I am logged in, meaning I have an access token. And if I refresh here, you can see this default organization now has 1 user, right? And I can click on view users. You can see that new user was automatically assigned to that default organization. Okay, now we can use these codes here as the tenant ID, right? So I'm just going to copy this, and here I'm going to say that this expense, the first expense here, was actually created by this particular organization. Okay, I'll save that. And let's say the second one as well. Okay, so the first two were created by this particular organization, but the other expense was created by some other organization. Right, so this has a different tenant ID, right? So I'm doing it manually here in my database. In the real world, of course, in your app, this would all be done automatically as you actually create an expense. You would check who's making that request, you would get their organizational code, and then you would insert it into the database, right? So, but here, the point here is that we have some data. Only part of the data belongs to this particular organization, right? So now when I refresh, I'm logged in as a user that's part of default organization, right? But I can still see all of the data, which is absolutely not what we want, because what we are doing right now is we are just getting all of the data like this. We don't have the where clause in here. So very importantly, when you have this strategy where you have one database and everything is in one schema, you need to be very, very mindful that you include your where filter here. So here we want to say we only want to get the expenses where the tenant ID is the, well, organization of the incoming request or the user that's making that request. So how do we get that? Kind allows us to get everything on the server side with this one function, get kind server side session. And we can get a couple of things from here, but one of the things we can get here is get organization. So there's an incoming request, and kind will let us know in that incoming request, and kind will let us know which user and which organization that user is part of is making that request. So here it's actually a function, so I do need to call it. So then here we get the organization information, and it's just organization.org code that we can then use to make sure we only get the appropriate data. If I now save here and refresh, you can see I now only get these two items, and that is correct, right? Group dinner and new desk, they indeed belong to that default organization, right? This is the cool organization that we just created with a different one. It has no users yet. You can see we are not getting this one, right? So now this is appropriately filtered out. Okay, so we have some TypeScript issues here, so we can check if it actually exists. If there is no organization or it doesn't have an organizational code, we can give the user a message that they're not part of some organization, but probably all the users are going to be part of some organization. So if there is no organization in the request, it probably means the user isn't logged in. So we might as well just redirect them to the API route, so Kind will in turn manage that with their own Kind hosted login page. Right, so here it's very important that we have all of these queries, and here I'm just getting data, but same with updating data, that you have this condition. Right, and actually, I think as a best practice, I have separate videos on this. You may want to consider creating a data access layer. It's a bit of a fancy word, but this is essentially where you could do all of your interaction with your database, right? So one centralized place where you have all of the interaction with your database. So here I have expense.ts. So I would simply create a function that will get all the expenses. You can pass in the ID, and then in here, I'm doing the actual interaction with my database. And so then I can just use get expenses and import that. So here now I don't really have to worry about forgetting or not forgetting that where clause, because I'm going to manage all of the data access, all of the database interactions in one place here, and which has many other benefits, by the way. There are other traps that you can fall into in Next.js because of server components and other and server actions as well, by the way. So I would say data access has many benefits. Basically one place where you do all the database access, and then here you can make sure you are including this where clause. There are other ways to structure this, but when you do it like this, when you're actually developing your app, adding new features, you don't have to constantly worry about that, because you have one centralized place where you already manage those kinds of requirements. So I think this would be a cleaner solution. All right, now one other thing I want to show you here as well is it's also very easy in Kind to set up roles and permission. Right, so I can go to settings here, and then here I have roles and permission. The idea here is that you have permissions, which are like the most granular unit of authorization. Let's say we have a permission that can read expenses, and we could have one for updating expenses, deleting them, allows user to read, to view, right? View, I'm calling it read, maybe just view expenses, to view expenses, right? View expenses or expense, right? Then save. And I could create other ones like creating an expense, updating an expense, and we can have more. We can have all of the right? Creating an expense, updating, deleting them. Actually, let's quickly add one more. Create expenses allows user to create expenses, and then we can say create expenses. Okay. I will save that as well. Right, so here's where you would have all of your granular permissions, and then you can have dozens of them, or maybe even hundreds in a big app. So you can assign a lot of them in one go with a role. Right, so I can say that there's going to be, let's say, a manager role. Right, so a manager in the expense app, I will just say manager, and I will also say manager here. Now here, what I can do is I can decide which permissions should be grouped under that role. Well, a manager can create expenses themselves as well, but they can also view expenses. Right? And maybe a basic user, maybe they can only create expenses, but maybe they should not be able to view expenses. Right? But a manager has broader permissions, so here I can assign those two permissions to a manager. Right now, none of the users in my app is actually a manager. I could decide to assign it to all the new users that sign up, but of course for a manager we don't want that. But for a basic user, let's create one more. Right, basic user, basic user, basic user. So every new sign up will automatically get this role. And what permissions do they have? Well, let's say they can only create expenses, and only managers should be able to view them. Now these are the roles and permissions we have. Now I already signed up here. The user that is already in here, let's go to that user. That's this user here. I can view profile, and here I can give that user a particular role. Right? Let's say that this user is actually a manager, so then they can actually view the expense. Okay, so I have now given that user a new role and permission. Now I'm already signed in from before, so I already had that token, right? So I'm going to click on sign out, so I can then sign in again for a new token. Yeah, so now I can sign in again. Okay, so now I'm back, and now before we actually interact with our database, we also want to take a look at the permissions that the user has. Right, get permissions. And actually with the permissions also comes the organizational code, which is actually very beneficial here. So we can just call that function await get permissions. In there will be an array of all the permissions that the user has. So we can check if it includes viewing and expense. If that's not the case, we want to return out of here, right? Something like this. And that result actually also has the organizational code. So if I save here, you can see I now still have access here because I am a manager, right? So here now we are getting more into the world of RBAC and access control. But that's very important with a setup like this. Your users' data in the same database, and we're not using separate schemas per tenant. If I undo this, by the way, so if I just make this a basic user, which can only create expenses, not view all of them. Now, if I sign out and sign back in again, let me sign in here. I will sign in, and let's see what happens. I should not be able to view. Yeah, so here you can see I'm actually redirected here to unauthorized, right? So that is working as expected, right? So this is a very important part, authentication and authorization, when you have this setup here where you have one database and you're not using separate schemas in a database. A startup that wants to take this approach because maybe it's faster, this is I think it's fine, but you have to be really mindful of the whole authentication, authorization, access control issue, right? So hopefully this helps you out a bit. There's a lot to talk about here, lots of things to figure out, but the good news is that we don't have to figure out all of the authentication, authorization from absolute scratch, because we have Kind. Kind helps you out with a lot of that authentication, authorization. So I would say check them out. You can find a link in the description. I want to thank Kind for sponsoring this video, and I want to thank you for watching. Have a nice day. Bye.